It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Hey folks, a bit of a trigger warning. This chat deals pretty much exclusively with suicide from the perspectives of two people who've lived through it. But it's a story of hope and of connection. If you do want to reach out and speak with someone, please see the supports listed on our website. Those of us with lived experience can play a unique and valuable role in supporting people affected by suicide. My next guest is someone I've been very keen to interview for a while, and you will soon understand why. Max Simensen has worked in mental health peer worker roles for over 7 years in the public mental health system. He has experienced intense times of suicidal thinking and behaviours over many years. Max is also the coordinator of Sydney's first operational safe haven, a new and innovative service model that gives people safe spaces to go to if they're experiencing suicidal crises, as an alternative to emergency departments, or EDs. I've always loved chatting with Max because the way he talks about suicide is both fresh and incredibly insightful. It resonates with many of my own experiences and those of many other people I know. Max also has the unique perspective of being a transgender man transitioning several years ago, as well as being someone bereaved by suicide when his sister took her life 2 years ago. Max and I got straight into it, and I hope you get as much satisfaction and insight from our chat as I did. One more thing, we don't hold back on any swear words, just so you know. So the one thing that comes up repeatedly from survivors is that very few people were ever willing to ask the question, why do you want to kill yourself? And especially clinicians. So would you be happy to talk about that?
Yeah.
All right. Did people ever ask you about why you wanted to kill yourself?
I feel like in my experiences, as soon as the suicide thing came on the cards, in terms of my own, when I was feeling suicidal, I had a suicide attempt, my first one. A lot of the conversations was around what was I going to do next? Like, it was so much about, okay, does he have a plan now? Is he safe to go home? What do we do now? And it became like suicide isolated on its own was the crux of the problem. That was what we needed to sort out, was just that we need to get you to stop wanting to end your life. And I think there's so much of suicide prevention where we focus so much on keeping people alive, but not supporting them or empowering them to actually live. Just being alive and having a beating heart is actually not living a meaningful life. Like, there's major other facets of how we should be thinking about people and supporting people. That's not just like, let's keep you alive for the next 24 hours. It's like, what can we do to reinvigorate your life? Or actually, for me, sometimes when I delved through suicidal thoughts and feelings, and for me, they tend to come up when I feel like I'm in a situation that I can't escape or I feel trapped. So once I learned that, when I do have suicidal thoughts and it gets to that point, I kind of just have that realization to myself of like, actually, if you do take your life, that is a change that you cannot undo. For a while, I kind of had like daily, weekly, and monthly kind of safety plans, or almost like life contracts in my mind.
Right.
So say it would be like, I'll give it another month and I'll do this new thing that's really out there, really wild. And for me, giving it a month was more palatable than trying to stay alive forever.
Yep.
It was like, let's use the next month to see if I can do something that makes me want to live.
Yep.
And through doing those month-to-month things and living day-to-day, week-to-week like that was how I survived really intense times in my life where I didn't have much opportunity. But I think for me, I now look at suicidal crisis as in there is something in my environment that I seriously need to change. I need to figure out where something is and change that, because they're all these things together. I'm feeling trapped. I feel like there's no room to move. And even if it's like, a stressful job or a stressful relationship, is that job worth dying for? No, I don't care about it that much, but it's causing me that much stress that I'm feeling trapped. So stepping back and looking at those kinds of things. But I think suicide gets looked at so simply in that you're suicidal and we need to get you to the point that you're not. And keeping people safe is different than supporting them to live. And people are looking for zest for life. They need to feel invigorated again, and they need to feel like, tomorrow could be exciting. And just keeping someone not dead doesn't do that. And I think in my experience, people are scared to ask around suicide because they either don't feel comfortable with whatever answer you'll give, or they kind of can't control your outcome. A lot of people don't want to unlock things that they can't fix.
When you talk, I kind of get this, I don't know the word. It's like someone gets me, or someone's talking in a way of an experience that I really relate to that not many people do. And so what you're saying is that when you think about suicide, it means there's a problem that needs fixing, that's complex or complicated. When I used to think about suicide, and I don't think about suicide much anymore, which is a delight and frankly a surprise too. But when I used to think about suicide and when I used to try and suicide, sometimes when I would describe it to myself, the part of me that wanted to kill myself felt like a inarticulate but very caring older brother who just wanted me to not hurt. I describe suicidal thinking as being almost like an Ugg boot or a doona. It wasn't the angry thing that a lot of people sometimes think it is. Not for me anyway. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I actually believe that there are so many people that feel like we do. A lot of people haven't necessarily had the resources or talk to other people to find words and how to give analogies to explain this. So I feel like that's one of the things with suicide in general, is that the way that we talk about it is very filtered. And I think it's the power of the lived experience movement of people who have lived through it, that have sat with it, explored it, and understood it to give it a different type of meaning. And I think for me, knowing that suicide is an option that would get rid of all of your problems in one foul swoop, feelings, problems, all of it done. You would never have to ever fucking deal with it again.
Absolutely.
And that is tempting to a point, but then also sometimes it's comforting knowing that it's like a backup plan, really. For me, it's helped me in major parts of my life be able to live more myself and authentic, because that was an option where I think, even when I transitioned, for me, it was kind of like, I'm willing to die in this current phase. And my transition kind of came about because the first agreement was like, let's try a month where we start thinking about transitioning stuff, or let's do a month where you get certain types of clothes that you've wanted. Let's do a month like that and see if that changes it. And for me, so much of my conviction and strength in my transition was knowing that if it got too hard, I could do that. And I think it's hard to explain to people sometimes how suicide is one of our things that protect us and can give us real independence. And for me, it's kind of a decision that I can control, that no one can take away from me, that I know is there. And I know how to use that kind of suicide option as a thing that's positive for me in my life, which I think a lot of people can be confused about. But it helps me throw myself so much more authentically into decisions, into projects, into things like that, because I know that I'm not going to be locked into this. And through doing that over time has been how I've been able to build a life that stopped me from thinking that I wanted to end my life, if that makes sense. So I have different types of suicidal crisis, where one is like, I'm actually at a point where I'm starting to plan. I'm really not seeing much logic. Like I'm really deep in it. Other times it flickers in my head throughout the day where it'll pop in. And that is a warning signal to me that something or someone in the environment is causing a bit of a reaction in me. And I can use it as a bit of a guide on how things are going. I know from speaking to many, many people over the years that it's very, very common for when you're younger, you don't have access to resources to escape situations or to leave things. So for me, it was a tangible strategy and a tangible option that I could control that could not be taken away from me.
Mm.
And there's a real sense of empowerment in knowing that you could do that.
Yeah. You just described a couple of times knowing that suicide was an option was protective and helped you be more authentic.
Mhm. Absolutely.
You don't hear that much.
No. And I think it's the kind of part of suicidal crisis that we don't talk about enough, because once we do know that about it, it can be feeling suicidal, and suicidal thoughts can actually be used as a tool for well-being. They're actually not something to destroy and fight. For me, I think that they're something to observe
Yes.
and notice and put together. So it can be a warning signal. And
Mm.
if I ignore suicidal thoughts and feelings and fight them off and just ignore them, I end up, getting more mentally unwell. So things like my behaviors will get more impulsive or lash out, or I'll retreat from social time, and all of those things tend to happen after it. So I think, to be honest, we all live in a suicide prevention space. Like, it's a massive thing in our, it's not just like you go to work and do it, like it's around all the time.
Mm.
And I think once we look at suicidal thoughts and feelings as a reaction or a signal, we can work in the space much better with working with what someone's got. It helps with sitting in the space as well, because you're not trying to get them to fight that, or you're not trying to shut that down. You're going, right, like, let's actually think about other times this has popped in, or why do you think it pops in there? Why do you think it's come into your train of thought? And doing more of that kind of curious exploring of it than it is like, we need to get you to stop feeling this way, because that is also something so deterring for me. When I've been in a suicidal crisis and people have said that, I'm like, it sounds it sounds quite bad, but for me at those times, I felt like, how selfish for all of you to want me to stay alive in all of this pain, so you don't feel the pain. I remember thinking, that doesn't seem fair. That's not right. That's your shit.
I've had those exact same thoughts too. Hey, like, when people don't want you to die, it's for selfish reasons. And that, to an extent, I mean, to an extent, people want you to also experience the future. But I mean, what you were talking about, it, and it happened to me a lot too. Like, when you're in a hospital, or you're seeking treatment, or you're speaking to a psychiatrist, or even to friends, and they will attack the suicidal thinking as the problem, but never ask the question. Now, can you tell me how Safe Haven operates?
So I guess the model in itself is based on having people who have survived their suicidal crisis. In our work, we use peer work values, but what we try to do is offer an option to ED where you can walk into a space that's not hospital, it's not home, so somewhere to go to that is staffed by people who have been through or currently going through what you're living through right now. And the model, I think, in itself is based on hope, which is a very loaded word that's used so much, but it's based on hope. I think not as in we sit around and talk about hope, but the hope where you see people living through, or you see that they've done it. They don't have to speak. It's them doing what they're doing now, and being in the role is enough to instill hope. And focusing on giving people a space where they can talk about, suicide in a way that is open and unpack it. And we're not scared of it. There's a certain fear that comes up when someone brings it up for their safety, but we don't jump into, okay, let's get this fixed for you. This is the problem. Let's fix it. Safe Haven, the benefits of the model is having someone to sit in that space with you and be present and sit, like sitting in shit with you. Like, you feel like your life's a pile of shit, you're a piece of shit. Sometimes you need someone to get down into the shit with you and be in there and just be, an observer of it and just listen.
Just sit and not try and fix, just sit.
And be present, like a compassionate observer.
Yeah.
Where you're observing and taking in and looking at their situation and seeing them.
Yep.
I think the emergency departments in hospitals aren't built for that kind of space. There's not that
Yeah.
amount of time.
Yep.
You know, you've got triage lists where people figure out how unwell you are and what support you need and things like that. And
Yep.
I think there's a real need that a lot of people who have lived it, but a lot of services and stuff have seen, we need a space where people can go and do that talking and do that
Yeah.
sitting with. And the model being peer-led and being centered around lived experience as well is quite contemporary, where it's a peer service. A lot of suicidal crisis can tend to become, you know, a clinical issue where for us, talking and being heard and having dialogue about it is what's needed. I think just being able to go somewhere where something stops, you know, and in emergencies and hospitals, things are so fast paced, and it's the next thing, the next person you have to see, the next person, triage this, whatever. It's so fast paced because there's so many things they have to do. But I think safe haven and what I've seen benefit people is being able to come in somewhere that's just like slowed. You know, you come in and have a coffee, and it almost can pause time a bit.
Yeah.
Where things just slow down.
Sometimes when I wanted or want to disclose that I'm thinking about suicide, what's a drag is sometimes I feel I have to coach the person before I give them that information, because they'll be more panicked than they need to be, for one thing. And it will be really disruptive and often not even helpful. So that's where I've often made the decision, fuck it. I can't be fuck coaching this person to receive the information that I'm that distressed that it becomes more burdensome to actually disclose than to not disclose.
Yes. And I think like it's really hard to discuss, and I find myself doing it sometimes where like I'll be talking about it, but I'll say at the beginning, like, just so you know, I don't have a plan and I'm not going to do anything tonight, whatever, but and you do a prelude to try to, you know, soften it for people so they don't feel as fearful. And it's not helpful as soon as I start to filter my actual feelings, the benefit of talking about them goes away, because it's not authentic. It's not, you know, I'm cautious about the impact of the other person. And I really just need a space where I can kind of say whatever chaotic, wild shit I need to say.
Yeah.
So that it can be seen from someone else, but then also for me to really look at it.
I mostly have a sunny disposition, 100%. When I'm in a catatonic depression, I don't. And I can have a sunny disposition and be thinking about suicide and still actually be happy. I can be a happy person, and many people can, and still are thinking about suicide and planning it and that sort of thing too.
There's so many people right now who would be going to work completely fine, and you would not know from the outside because people mask it.
Yeah. Max, it's been so good to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If this has brought up any big feelings that you'd like to talk with someone about, you can reach out to the resources listed on our website. If there's one thing you can take from this chat, know that you're not alone. We know intimately how dark things can get. But there are futures you may never have imagined. Max and I are testament to this. Welcome to Club Mind. Today you've got Chris, Kaz and I once again. And we wanted to talk about Max's interview because it could be a bit close to the bone. And we also had our own perspectives as workers in the mental health sector with lived experience of mental distress. So welcome, guys.
Hey. Thanks for having us.
What did you think?
I took so many little notes as I was listening to that interview. I think probably too many to cover. I was thinking so many. Should I just start on one? I'll just start on one.
Yeah.
He was talking about the prelude that you have to give to clinicians to soften the blow. You know, like I don't have a plan. I'm not going to act on it. You know, make sure that when you do get into the suicidal thoughts, that there's some padding. You know, you can share, but don't share too much that you get hospitalized. And then it's not authentic, like he was saying. It's not authentic. And if you start crying, um, then you seem out of control, very distressed. So thinking about a place where you could just get into it, like, I just want to die. I don't feel like going on anymore. And to feel like you're not going to get hospitalized, oh, how divine.
Absolutely. And not having to put that filter on. Like, I think that is so powerful. And I find I put that filter on a lot automatically when I talk about my mental health and how I'm feeling inside. And I do that for friends and family. And it's almost like to protect them. So I don't cause them any distress, because if I cause them distress, then I'll feel worse. I find it's a rare thing for me to be able to talk openly, filtered free. And if Safe Haven is a place for that, that's amazing that a place like that exists, where you don't have to have that filter there.
I mean, if you could change the way we talk about suicide, how could people be better equipped to hear the words, I want to kill myself?
Not get into a panic about it. I'm always baffled by the fact that as humans, the thing that we're most terrified of generally is the most inevitable thing in the entire world. We go around living our lives being scared of the only inevitable thing in life is that we die. And our whole life is based around preventing that. And to me, the real tragedy is living a life of suffering, or never really living at all. I don't know if it's humanly possible, but to shift our perspective on death. So if somebody comes to you and they say, I've been suffering immensely for years, I don't feel like being alive anymore. We shouldn't be panicking at the I don't want to be alive anymore. We should be panicking at, oh my God, you've been suffering for years. Like, I feel like the wrong thing triggers us. We're more receptive to somebody wanting to die. That's what sends us off, and not really listening to somebody saying, but I haven't really been living for years. If humanity could shift their idea of death being this terrifying thing and think about quality of life versus quantity. I mean, I definitely do not want to live to be 80. God, no, that sounds horrible. I mean, like, I mean, if somebody could help me get to a quality of life where I wanted to live to 80, I would talk to that person, you know?
Yeah. 80 might be better when we are 80. But what you were saying was interesting, because Max said pretty loud and clear that awareness that suicide was possible allowed him to live authentically.
Mm.
And that's pretty daring stuff to say. What do you reckon?
Wow. I think living authentic maybe gave him a certain freedom, or an option that this doesn't have to go on forever, and that this crappy feeling or these crappy feelings don't have to go on forever.
Even outside of mental health, the realization that you're living because you want to live and not because it's just an instinct is like, I mean, everyone would hopefully have that realization one day. It's like, I'm choosing to live every day now, because a lot of people, most people just live because they're alive and they've got the instinct not to die. So a lot of people who have gone through a lot of suicidal ideation and thoughts and stuff have the perspective of life is a choice, which a lot of people don't understand, that life is a choice. You don't have to be alive if you don't want to be.
And I think people are so scared of death, like you were saying before, Kaz, even though it is inevitable. I think they're scared of it because it's inevitable. And also because, it's unexpected. Like, nobody knows when their life might be cut short. And also nobody knows what's beyond it. So I think that uncertainty is what people are most afraid of. And that's why they freak out when they hear that somebody wants to end their life. Because they're like, we don't know what happens next. We don't know where you'll go. We don't know how we're going to cope with you and in your life.
Wherever we do go, we're going there anyway, you know.
Exactly.
One day I do have a friend, and I know a lot of people hold this opinion, but I was feeling like dying one day, and he said to me, oh, you can't kill yourself. That's the easy way out. What's going to happen is you're going to be reincarnated, and you're going to come back into something that's even worse than your current situation, because you have to learn a lesson before you can go on to whatever's next. And he stated that as if it was a scientific fact. Like, okay, so that's 100% what's going to happen. So there's like a lot of speculation.
Well, do you think people who are scared of death have not learnt to live fully yet?
I don't know if living fully helps you accept death anymore. The reality is, when I am feeling suicidal, I feel very calm about what happens after it. Whatever will be, will be. And then there are times where I'm very scared about what will happen after, where people's thoughts or people's perspectives and stuff get into my head. And I'm like, ooh, what if there is a special place in hell if you suicide? I don't know. I think it's a state of mind accepting death. I think sometimes we can, sometimes if we're anxious, we're a bit scared about it. I don't know. Does that answer it? Like, I don't know if we feel all day, every day the same about death as we do in certain situations. And I don't know if living to your fullest means that you fully accept death all the time.
I think people avoid thinking about the inevitability of death and want distractions from it as much as possible. And I don't know, like, I grew up in a very religious family, and my grandma on my mother's side, she had a really difficult, hard life. And it was almost like the fact that they believed that the afterlife exists was like a reward for her at the end of this hard life. But she lived to 80, and like, she really struggled to enjoy life. And it's like, why have that 80 years of suffering and for the hope of like a better life next time, or like a better afterlife? It's almost like an acceptance of the suffering in this life for, the hope of a better eternal life or whatever. Yeah, we're getting off.
No, this is totally on topic to me. Let's do a thought experiment. This auntie of yours?
My grandma.
Your grandma. Did she believe that the suffering that she endured in life guaranteed her a spot in heaven or the afterlife?
No, I think she just firmly believed that afterlife and heaven existed. And it gave her hope for her current life that, okay, this exists, and I'm going to be reunited with, the children that I've lost. I'm going to be happy in that life.
What do you think kept her from not ending her life earlier than 80 years?
I think, her connection to her children. And also, I think, realistically, like, guilt was probably a huge thing that kept her. Because it's like, life is a gift, and it's something that you don't just throw away. And like, suicide is almost seen as like throwing away your life and this gift. But if it's something that brings about suffering, then is it really a gift? Like, definitely not. Like, and I'm grateful she stayed alive to 80, and I had a really good relationship with her. But I also know she went through so much suffering, and that suffering went down into the next generation, like for her children, like my mother and her siblings, and it's gone down to grandchildren and stuff like that as well. So I don't see suffering as, a gift, I guess, or something that, just has to be accepted.
Life can be really hard, much harder than what I ever suspected when I was a kid, as an adolescent, and even in my 20s. And suicide totally made sense to me. For a long time, it was rational. I think suicidal thinking can be rational and not necessarily a sign of mental illness, like we're told. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. It can be a measured rational choice. You can put all the issues that are going on onto an Excel spreadsheet and really rationalize it. There's no way out of it except ending life earlier than it should be ended. Definitely doesn't have to be a sign of mental illness. Absolutely not. No.
And I think Max explained it well when he was sort of saying it is a solution to all of like those problems. And he was explaining that it was like a solution in like a logical kind of way that, X, Y, Z problem will disappear. You won't have to deal with that. But I think when he was saying that there is no undo, I think that's the flip side of it, is there is no undo button.
Yeah, totally. And to be fair and honest, there are people who haven't thought it through. There are a lot of suicides that are impulsive and not measured. And the ramifications of all suicides come with 1,000 other problems. We know that too. But it can be a solution. It doesn't sit easily to say that, but what do you reckon? How would we say this in our jobs in suicide prevention?
We can't. Despite all my thoughts and feelings on suicide, if one of my clients tells me that they are suicidal, alarm bells go off and I go into clinician role, because I personally don't have a say in what is to be done in this situation. There's protocol. And it feels heartless because, like Max said, I've got to make sure that they have a heartbeat, that's what needs to happen. And I wish that there was more leeway in our roles to explore their suicidality more and not go straight into, well, I've got to make sure that by the end of the day, you're alive by the time I clock out of work. Isn't that horrible? Isn't that just horrible?
It is. It definitely is.
Because I've been on the flip side where I'm looking into the eyes of dead-eyed, dead-faced clinicians who are just like asking me how suicidal I am. I'm like, oh God, I don't want to be them. Oh.
There should be, as you were saying, Kaz, like space in roles working in suicide and with clients at risk of suicide. There should be space to explore deeper in every person's life and to work out how improvements could be made so that we don't have to prevent somebody from wanting to end their life because their life is good enough that they don't want to.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be ideal.
When you were speaking, one thing I was thinking is that both Chris and I have the term peer in our job titles. And from my perspective, that gives me a few extra permissions that others don't have. And one of those permissions is that I do not go into that risk assessment stuff because I'm allowed to not do that. I can go into the exploration stuff of, why do you want to die? Tell me what's going on. And that's not only, I wouldn't call it a luxury, that's an absolute honor, but a great permission to have, because I hope that I can be the voice or the person who I wanted when I was suicidal too. But yeah, it's in the workforce. Of course, it's much harder. What's your experience, Chris?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the peer job title for me allows me to hold space for people more and allows me to hear what people have been going through up to this crisis point that they've reached. There's still the time when I need to put my clinician hat on and assess risk and ensure that this person stays alive. But there is a lot more room to explore what's been leading up to it and to hold space for that person to talk about what's been leading up to this suicidal crisis. And I think in an ideal world, that exploration shouldn't be like timed. It should take as long as it takes. It takes time to build that rapport. I think like that space should be held for as long as the person needs it. In a realistic world with like jobs and targets and stuff like that, you can't hold space for an unlimited amount of time.
I'm glad you said that. And one perspective we haven't heard is that of the clinician. And I managed to actually interview a clinician and get their opinion on this too and their perspective. So thanks for listening to Club Mind. That's me, Leon, Chris, and Kaz. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome to Out of the Box. So far, we've talked about the perils of emergency departments and the frustrations of how we can be treated by clinicians, especially around things like risk assessment. I'm someone who's been to emergency departments countless times after suicide attempts. Now I work in the public hospital system in suicide prevention. In EDs, there is little space or time to talk in any depth about reasons you might be suicidal. However, something that I notice continually is that the frustrations we experience are shared by both clinicians and consumers. I was delighted to speak with one of those clinicians. Tim is a nurse practitioner in mental health, based in the emergency department at one of the busiest public hospitals in Sydney. He's been there for 21 years. He's also an associate professor and teacher at the University of Sydney. We sat down together and he spoke generously and candidly about his experiences and what continues to drive his passion.
Can you describe what it's like in an emergency department? What's the vibe?
Well, it's time pressured. It's an intense vibe, and it's a bit chaotic, and it's random. I often say we're at the mercy of randomness in the emergency department, so you never know what will be thrown up at any particular day. It can be quiet for several hours, and all of a sudden 4 or 5 people come through the door that need to be seen pretty promptly. So I think that's the nature of the beast, really. It's hard to know what's going to happen, but I think we also need to be very mindful of timeliness. You know, people will come to emergency with an expectation they're going to be seen as soon as possible, and I think that expectation should be met wherever possible. We have a team of mental health nurses in emergency at RPA, and our mantra has always been to see people as close to the front door as possible. It's not always possible if you're juggling 3 or 4 different things at once, but I think timeliness is key. And I think, you know, reassuring people, providing some therapeutic response to me is what I've gotten out of back from people is that they came to the emergency department for some therapeutic intervention. It was one person put it, I came to be assisted, not assessed. And so I think emergency should be about not just, you know, very clinical assessment focus, but on being receptive to people in distress.
Yeah. It's such a tough place, and I'm sure you've heard this so many times. On a side issue, I need to tell you, I stayed in Marie Bashir 3 years ago. I was scheduled there, and it was one of the best experiences. So the public hospital system, I've had really positive experiences of public hospitals, and I know not everyone has. And what I've always said or observed as someone who works in a hospital in acute care in mental health is that the only critique I can make of people is actually not of people, it's of a system, and people are fatigued.
I think that fatigue's compounded in the last 6 months to a year, especially with the way we have to work now. You know, I worked this week and saw several people in emergency, and I'm having conversations about their mental health challenges in full PPE. I'm wearing goggles, mask, hard to have a conversation with. It's more difficult to convey my emotions and more difficult to see the emotions in people as well. So it makes that work a lot more laborious and not as rewarding for me and I suppose the person I'm speaking to.
Yeah.
So I think fatigue's right, yeah.
Why are you in this job? How'd you get there?
Well, it keeps me coming back. Well, I guess I've spent my first 10 years of nursing in the acute mental health system, so Roselle Hospital and Missenden Unit, those kind of places, and I found my passion when I started in emergency in year 2000, and for me it's just been a much better fit for me. You know, there's some things about the mental health system that rubbed me up the wrong way. And I don't think I would have survived as a mental health nurse in the public mental health system. I'm much more comfortable within that emergency environment. And, you know, I know emergency is a pretty rough place to be. It's a rough place for every human being. But I've just found the particular people I've grown up with there in emergency really socially minded, open-minded. These are a bunch of nurses and doctors I've been working with for many years. And the culture there, despite it being a really harsh environment, is actually quite positive. So I work with a very positive bunch of people. And, you know, we know there's room for improvement. Don't get me wrong. I think we can always improve emergency response, not just for every human being. But yeah, I think it's just, I'm humbled by the people I meet. I feel immensely privileged to meet the people I do. I get the impression that what I do provides some benefit for the majority of people I see. I know it's not everyone. And so, I just think it just seems like a really good fit for me. And I do often tell people when I say goodbye to them from emergency, you know, I'll always be here. So if you want to come back, just give me a call. It might sound a bit cheesy, but it's also something I kind of believe in, that there's no reason why I'd ever see myself not working there in some capacity. So, yeah, I think it's a very grounding place. I always say emergency is the great human leveller, you know, in positive and negative ways. I know and I say to people, it's not a comfortable place, but I'd like to think for the most part it's a safe place.
I never thought, and I've never thought about it, but I've never thought I'd hear someone say that was the right fit. It sounds like what you described was the level up, but also it sounds like there's a really socially minded cohort of staff there. Yeah. Is there something innate to emergency more than, say, residential wards that you like?
Well, I like the high turnover, the high acuity. As I said, I think the sort of hierarchical environment. So the senior nurses and doctors all work very much in a collaborative ways. And the most senior doctors are there on the floor night and day. They don't just do Monday to Friday, they do shift work. So there's not so much of the chip on the shoulder. So it's all very much a team-based approach, which I like. I think what I've found really mostly rewarding is having conversations with people really in the depths of distress and despair, but still finding an opportunity to have conversations about how they might start to just turn the situation around. So I use the word turning points. You've ended up in emergency following an overdose, and this is a bit of a red flag, and maybe it's a sign that something needs to be different, you know. And so I can see that there's an opportunity to have conversations with people that might be just, you know, create some sort of a turning point in their lives, you know, or an opportunity to do things differently. Yeah. So I think opportunistic, you know, these opportunistic conversations. Yeah. I get asked to see people who wouldn't normally look for mental health care, but they've ended up in emergency, and one of my colleagues picks up that they might need to have a chat with someone and refers someone to me, often really well observed. And so, you get to see people who probably wouldn't necessarily put their hand up for those conversations.
Do you think people are scared to talk about suicide?
I think broadly they are. When I talk to people about suicide who are, you know, patients, they seem quite comfortable talking about their suicidal thoughts. But I just think from a societal perspective, it's a bit of a taboo. But I've found just being so upfront about living and dying is something that most people really respect. You know, they're quite relieved to be able to have a frank conversation, free of judgment, free of moralising. And I find when I'm working most therapeutically with people talking about suicide is just being quite blunt about it, to be honest. You know, basically putting it out there that, you know, I'm hoping that despite all you've been through, the seriousness of the situation, I'm hoping that you'd rather live than die. Yeah. Am I right? On balance, you know. I'd like to think that as harrowing as the situation is, it's not worth you dying over. Yeah. You know, would we agree on that? So I just try to find ways of reframing the situation with people so that they can have an opportunity to maybe see it differently, but still talk about, well, what's the first small thing I might be able to do to start, you know, getting some traction on this, you know.
It's so hard, isn't it? It's because I sometimes, as someone who's, you know, been to emergency wards so many times, and I sometimes find it. I'm actually an optimistic person who actually likes people, and I actually have a sunny disposition, except when I'm in catatonic depression. But I'm not unfamiliar with despair.
Yeah.
And blatantly, sometimes I've seen some people in long-term friends or otherwise, and I think, how are you alive? And why are you alive?
I mean, I'm often asking the question of people who have had long-term challenges, what is it that keeps you going? How have you managed to survive for this long? I'm really curious about those conversations, interested in those conversations with people. And again, that's, I guess, what humbles me about the work I do as well, is just how people can endure through, what are really overwhelming experiences. Often people have really disappointing times from the time their life began. That life has been a real disappointment, and trauma and adversity has been a companion since the childhood. And I'm often just asking people, well, what have you done to survive through that, through this for so long? And I think people are kind of relieved to have that conversation as well, without saying, well, suicide's not an option. I don't want to sound insensitive about suicide, but I see suicide as an option for a lot of people, but I'm interested in talking about options other than suicide, alternatives to suicide. Can we park suicide for now? And let's have a conversation about options other than suicide. And I find mostly people are interested in having conversations about other things than suicide, but I think realising that it's an understandable response to a pretty unpleasant situation, and I think that's what is generally misunderstood, is that suicidal thoughts are really common. And lots of people have suicidal thoughts. It's the act of suicide that's actually statistically pretty rare. I think suicidal thoughts are understandable in the context of what people endure in their lives,
This is the first year I've really gotten to speaking very candidly with people about their relationship with suicide. And the first time I actually admitted, and it was to my psychologist, that suicidal thoughts, and I finally put words around them, they were the only thing that comforted me for many years.
When you say comfort, was it like, oh, at least there's always suicide? Is that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've had people say similar things. That, I know I've always got that. If nothing else works for me, I think that's totally understandable. Like I said, I don't moralise about it. I know a number of people who've died by suicide, and there's a couple I'm a bit pissed off with, but I respect what they've done. I know they had really arduous existence, and so I think, well, that's unfortunately what we have to accept with some people, that they will choose that option. Thankfully, it's a very small number of people, but I think we have to be realistic that until we resolve a lot of the social inequalities, not the chemical imbalances, but the social imbalances, we'll still always have people dying by suicide.
In the time between now and the smashing of capitalism, we'll probably have suicide for a while.
Yeah. I guess what we have to accept about suicide is that it's not often, or predominantly, it's not a really thought out and planned. I mean, obviously people do plan it, but often it's a very impulsive response to a very acute distress on the background of some long-standing challenges. But people often will do it in a very spare of the moment decision, and that's, I guess, the challenge we face too, is that it fluctuates. So there's no real predictability around it. So, I mean, you've been there. So do you identify with it being something that comes in waves, or ebbs and flows, or is it constant, or? Everyone's different, I guess.
Yeah, it used to be absolutely omnipresent.
Yeah, okay.
Always. But for me, did it come in waves? Not anymore.
Yeah.
It was, but circumstances absolutely dictated it, and belief systems too.
Yeah, I mean, a good example for me is a guy who I'd seen on and off in emergency for many years, and I run an outpatient service where people come back to see me. This is a guy who I'd spent a long time, supporting and working with, and we got on really well. He was artistic and funny, talented in so many ways, and he had his own challenges with alcohol at times, but he had done so well. He worked so hard, and then within a couple of days he'd end up getting back into drink and unraveling a little bit. And then ended up in a mental health unit and came out and emailed me to say, can we catch up? I said, sure, let's catch up. Let's get back on a positive footing. And then 2 days later, he died. And I guess that's an example of someone I thought, oh, come on, mate. You know, you'd done so. We were getting there. You were getting there, not we, but you were getting there. You know, you'd come so far, and I'm sort of, you know, a bit disappointed for him that he chose to do that when I thought that, because there was so much promise in this guy. You know, I've still got photos of some of his sculptures and some of his art, and they're just amazing. And you know, I just think, oh, mate.
Totally.
Yeah.
I was listening to you while also being conscious that you worked in a mental health emergency in a major city hospital.
Yeah.
And I assume you would have seen, heard, witnessed, experienced a lot of consumers you're working with die. I mean, that's your bread and butter. Yeah. How do you sit with that? How do you approach that?
Well, I think it is about being prepared to sit with it, to listen, and I feel like listening's been something that I've developed a really good skill at you know, actively listening, being with people and not reacting, being prepared to sit with people in distress, providing that, bearing witness to their distress, providing that human-to-human connection. You know, we've done a few studies, Leon, of people who've come through emergency, and one of the key themes that comes out of that from seeing a mental health nurse, not just me but others of our team, is the therapeutic value of being listened to and understood. You know, it's not rocket science, but it's fundamentally therapeutic. You know, yeah.
It's so obviously. I mean, it seems so obvious. It seems so self-evident, but I forget. Yeah. Oftentimes, I remember once when I was 17 and I was in a emergency ward, and it was a nurse who was not working with me, but she came past, knowing that I was a 17-year-old who just tried to kill himself, and just leant close to me and said, things will get better, and walked away. And that I clearly still remember that all these years later. There's something about that too, the gesture of kindness.
Yeah, kindness and compassion. I mean, I genuinely have an interest in what I do. You know, I really like that clinical space. You know, I think it's, as I said at the beginning, it just feels like a really good fit for me. And so that, I guess, means I'm more capable of working in that space. So, you know, I think I'm scarred by some of it, don't get me wrong. But as I said, there's an element of privilege about what I do, strong element of privilege. And yeah, I think for me, I just love human beings, you know. I love interacting with human beings, and I think I'm quite an empathic individual. You know, I can see the perspective of other people and what they've had to endure. And again, that humbles me. You know, I've had a pretty privileged life, and so I think seeing how much underprivileged people experience and hardship really makes me really want to be of any assistance to them. And I mean, like I said about the mental health service, it's still a bit caught up to my mind in, you know, assessment and risk factors and risk assessment, and I just don't find that's very clinically useful, you know. So I think we've got to shift our attention onto that human-to-human therapeutic work with people around living and dying, rather than asking them a whole heap of assessment-type questions like, do you have thoughts of suicide? What's your plan? Do you have the means? You know, categorising people as high, medium or low. All that really anxiety-provoking stuff that really has no science associated with it. So to me, it just comes down to that fundamental human work, you know. Yeah.
How do you think it should be approached? What should occur in emergency departments?
The first thing we should be doing with someone who comes to the ED with suicidal thoughts is congratulating them for coming, thanking them for coming, instead of acting on those thoughts, and reassuring them that we can help them. You know, so you know, I always say the person who comes to the ED with thoughts of suicide clearly would rather not act on those thoughts. Or that's what I'm imagining. So let's focus on discussions other than suicide, options other than suicide. But this whole, you know, plans and means and thoughts focus, or assessment focus questions, I just don't think it gets us to where we really want to go with people, you know.
Tim and I spoke for well over an hour. I admire him and consider him a true ally. His perspectives, and those of staff in EDs, deserve our understanding, and I'm deeply grateful that he continues to support and advocate for us within a system that can be challenging for all of us.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandez,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager, with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.